That little square turn red occasionally, then you know you have a problem with your internet. But the biggest indicator is a difference between OBS and the live stream. If you're watching OBS and when someone subscribes it lags, or maybe it's smooth for an optimized game like Overwatch, and then the moment you turn on PUBG and it's spaghetti code, Bluehole being a software company, even worse than Microsoft. You fire up the game, OBS drops down to 5 frames per second, then you know it's your computer being overpowered. So first, let's talk about the 3 settings you can change to fix your problem if it is a bandwidth problem with your internet. The very first thing I would do in this situation is change your output resolution to 720p. 1080p has a total number of pixels of about 2 million. And if you're running at 60 frames per second, that means your internet is sending 2 million pixels 60 times every single second. Whereas if you crank that down to 720p, which frankly, half of your viewers are watching on their phone, they're not really going to be able to tell a staggering difference. You're dropping the total number of pixels from over 2 million down to less than 1 million. That's a massive difference in the amount of information that your computer has to send through the internet. However, this brings us to the second setting that you'll need to change. That is your video bitrate. You're gonna find this in the output settings of OBS. Video bitrate is how much information your computer is sending every single second. And as you can imagine, 720p requires about half the amount of bitrate to maintain the same level of quality because you have half the pixels. I figured you probably figured that out, but in case you didn't, that's why. So while 1080p and 60 frames per second will probably look great around 5 megabits, you can drop it down to 720p, and I would maintain a little bit of extra headroom, maybe bring it down to 3000 or 3500 kilobits per second without any extra compression added or integrity lost in your footage. If you're still having internet issues at that point, maybe, I don't know, you're running Comcast, drop it down to 720p, 30 frames per second, lower your bit rate down to about 2000 or 2500. If you can't get an upload speed better than that, switch internet providers, move. I don't care what you have to do, that's bad. But refresher course, those are the 3 settings that I would change if you're having problems with your internet bandwidth. First, drop to 720p, drop the video bitrate down to about 3500. If you're still having issues, drop the frames per second down to 30, and then drop the bitrate down to 2500. With the way bitrate works, keeping the resolution high while lowering that bitrate, you're gonna see a lot of weird pixelations going on when there's heavy movement on the screen. Lowering the resolution of the stream will actually maintain a higher integrity of footage. By the way, all these tips I've mentioned will also help you if the problem isn't your internet, but it's also your computer. The fewer pixels your computer has to push through to the internet, the easier it is on the components. But let's get into computer CPU overload and what might be causing your computer to not be able to handle this. There are two things that I would recommend you do first before lowering the quality of your stream. OBS is doing something pretty fantastic in real time. It's doing something that's really heavy on its load. It's called rendering. Essentially what it's doing is you're taking these multiple layers, whether it's your gameplay, then your camera, then your overlay, then your alerts, and then your stream labels, all the things that are layered on top of each other to make a stream, and it is taking all those elements and rewriting a brand new video with all those things combined. That process of creating all those layers and flattening them into one singular video is called rendering. If you've ever done any video editing, for example in Final Cut Pro, you've had to deal with this. If you've ever added a filter like color correction or maybe added a text layer on top, you know that Final Cut has to render. Otherwise, you lose quality of your footage. And that rendering, even on powerful computers, can take some time. For your computer to do this in real time is difficult. And the two best things you can do to lighten that load are remove any filters that you might have that are unnecessary, like maybe color correction, or consolidate multiple layers into a single layer. If you're using something like Muxy or Streamlabs, you've got an overlay layer, maybe even two if you've got an overlay and an underlay underneath your camera. You've got labels showing the most recent follower and donator, etc. You've got alert boxes using your browser source. All these causing extra layers that your computer has to render. Stream Elements has an amazing solution to this. You can go onto their website, you go to their overlay creator, you can upload your overlays, you can import alert boxes, you can do everything in this browser to create your entire stream, and then it gives you one link for a single browser source. I've created entire scenes in Stream Elements that were like 20 layers, and it consolidates them down to one layer, which really lightens the load on your PC. Those are the first two things I would do because you're not lowering the quality of your stream at all. So now you've eliminated 10 unnecessary sources. What is the last little bit you can do to save yourself some CPU power? Well, if you go to your output settings, you will see something called encoder preset. It'll even say in there higher equals less CPU, and it'll range from ultra fast down to slower. Essentially what this means is how much time the CPU spends on each frame. It's like, have you seen those images of a cartoonist spending a minute on a cartoon frame and then 10 seconds on a cartoon frame? You can see the quality of difference between them. The faster is going to look less, but it's easier on the computer because it doesn't have to spend as much time on all the details. So the faster you set your encoder preset, the easier it's going to be on your CPU, but you will see some of that weird pixelation going on your screen when you have a lot of movement at a time. I found that if you set it any slower than faster, there's not really much of a difference. Ultra fast down to slower. Essentially what this means is how much time the CPU spends on each frame. It's like, have you seen those images of a cartoonist spending a minute on a cartoon frame and then 10 seconds on a cartoon frame? You can see the quality of difference between them. The faster is going to look less, but it's easier on the computer because it doesn't have to spend as much time on all the details. So the faster you set your encoder preset, the easier it's going to be on your CPU, but you will see some of that weird pixelation going on your screen when you have a lot of movement at a time. I found that if you set it any slower than faster, there's not really much of a difference. I tried setting it on slowest, it clocked my CPU percentage up to 80%, and I saw no difference between that and faster. I mean, maybe like this much, but that's what we call diminishing returns. It's not worth it. I usually run it faster, and I brought it down to fastest, and it was a very minor change, but it dropped my CPU percentage almost in half. In fact, to test this whole thing before filming this, I dropped my resolution down to 720p, kept it at 60 frames per second, even kept the bitrate the same, and dropped the CPU preset down to very fast from faster, and my CPU usage went from about 32% down to 12%. That's almost down to a third of what the original processing power was.